Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast. Today, we are strapping on our analytical goggles and traveling back almost 2 centuries to 1838. We're diving deep into a text that, while maybe not instantly recognizable to everyone, it's absolutely foundational to modern economic theory.
It really is. We're talking about Antoine Augustin Cournot's Recherche sur les principes mathématiques de la théorie des richesses.
And for context, this was a project of, sheer intellectual audacity.
Oh, absolutely. Cournot was not an economist by trade. He was a highly respected mathematician, a French professional academic.
Right. He was rector of the Academy of Dijon.
Exactly.
Oh.
And he dared to introduce the rigorous forms and symbols of mathematical analysis, we're talking calculus essentially, into the domain of political economy.
A field that until then had been dominated by words. By dense, often contradictory literary prose and philosophical arguments.
And we really can't overstate how radical this was at the time. Cournot was walking right into a hornet's nest. He faced immediate and heavy resistance.
His own preface talks about this, right?
It does. He meticulously documents the prevailing belief. And this was strengthened by theorists like Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste, say that economics dealt with human factors. Things that were just too variable, too moral, too indeterminate to be quantified.
They called his work idle and pedantic.
They did. They dismissed mathematical forms entirely.
But Antoine Augustin Cournot, he saw this vagueness, this reliance on ordinary language as the central problem.
That was the whole issue for him. He believed the resulting obscurity and confusion, all these, indeterminate accessory ideas of utility, scarcity, suitability, that was exactly what had caused economists to divide into these warring schools.
So he sought clarity, precision.
Yes. He argued that by making the analysis of wealth concrete, or as he put it, determine it by symbols familiar to those with mathematical training, he could reveal the true underlying structure of it all.
So his goal was ambitious. He wanted to move economics from a sort of descriptive art to an analytical science.
A huge leap.
Yeah.
He needed to show that these tools, differential and integral calculus, could not only describe what happens in the economy, but could actually predict the stable relations and optimum points under specified conditions.
So our mission today is to unpack Antoine Augustin Cournot's core arguments. We are going to show you exactly how his pioneering use of mathematical functions and limits laid the groundwork for everything from, the modern understanding of demand and pricing to the surprising effects of competition and taxation.
And we're offering a kind of shortcut to understanding the mathematical scaffolding that defines modern economics.
And along the way, we'll see why his findings are often really counterintuitive, even to policymakers today.
They really are.
So let's start right at the beginning. With the fight Cournot had to wage just to justify his method, he's confronting this idea that mathematical forms were useless in this domain. What was the central misunderstanding he had to dismantle?
Well, the central flaw in the critic's argument, as Antoine Augustin Cournot saw it, was this assumption that the use of symbols and formulas must lead to immediate, practical, numerical calculations.
Okay. So people were thinking, if you can't use this equation to tell me the exact price of corn next Thursday, then the equation is worthless.
Precisely. That's it exactly. They were confusing the map with the territory. They were expecting the formula to provide the current data, not the underlying law that was governing the data.
So he had to clarify the real purpose of the math.
Yes. Antoine Augustin Cournot said the true purpose of mathematical analysis is not calculation, but demonstrating the fixed relations between magnitudes and functions, even when they cannot be expressed in numbers.
Right.
He used analogies from fields where this was already accepted, like the theory of probabilities or theoretical mechanics.
That's a powerful defense. In physics, for example, the laws of gravity allow us to describe the general shape of an orbit, right? Even if we need external empirical measurements to plot the exact position of a specific satellite right now.
Exactly. The math gives you the rule, not the immediate transient data point.
And Cournot argued that the algebraic notation, it provides a language for these abstract relationships that's just better than prose because it forces you to be clear.
It does. He drew a really sharp contrast here. He said authors like Smith and say they preserved all the beauties of a purely literary style, which, allowed for ambiguity. While others, like Ricardo, he said they often disguise complex algebraic reasoning under arithmetical calculations of tiresome length.
That's an observation that holds true even today when you read early economic texts. You spend pages tracing a chain of reasoning with percentages and fractions, only to realize later that the entire passage could just be summarized in one neat, concise equation.
And that was Antoine Augustin Cournot's point. He said algebraic notation allows the trained reader to read, at a glance in an equation, results reached arithmetically only with great labor and pains.
It's an efficiency tool for the mind.
It is. It lets you grasp these complex dependencies almost instantaneously.
And he also makes it clear that we're not just talking about simple multiplication here. I mean, he's talking about applying the highest level of mathematical rigor available at the time.
Oh, yes. He clarifies that solving the general questions in the theory of wealth relies on the analysis of what he called arbitrary functions that are restricted to satisfying certain conditions.
Which is what requires the heavy lifting of the differential and integral calculus.
That's right. To find, for example, the maximum possible profit a company can make, or the stable equilibrium point between two competitors, those are problems of finding the derivative, of calculus. That's not elementary algebra.
And that level of mathematical sophistication was it was unprecedented in economics.
It was. And I think his humility about his final ambition is really key to understanding the text. He didn't claim he was writing the definitive new system of political economy.
No, not at all.
His great goal, as Antoine Augustin Cournot stressed, was analytical clarity, not, doctrinal certainty. He wanted to clarify how far we are from being able to solve, with full knowledge of the case, a multitude of questions which are boldly decided every day.
So it was about defining the limit of what we know.
Exactly. And demonstrating what we don't know using precise tools. His argument was, look, if you can't even formulate the equation, you don't fully understand the dynamics, even if you can talk eloquently about them.
That sets the perfect stage. It tells us we are moving past rhetoric to look at the cold, hard, mechanical bones of the economic system as Cournot first identified them.
And for Antoine Augustin Cournot to build a rigorous analytical theory, he had to start by jettisoning all the philosophical baggage that was associated with the existing definitions of wealth.
Right. He needed to make a strict distinction between wealth and just mere physical possession or power.
And this is where that famous shepherd anecdote comes in to highlight the distinction.
Let's hear it.
So imagine a shepherd who possesses vast pasture ground and abundant cattle. He's a powerful landholder, sure, but Antoine Augustin Cournot argues that in a civilized state, this man is not rich if he cannot exchange those assets for what he truly prefers.
Like refined goods or services, or maybe just savings.
Exactly. Wealth, in a theoretical sense, has to be defined by the capacity for accumulation and exchange in a wide market.
So he insists on absolutely identifying wealth with exchangeable values. It's a purely abstract commercial definition, and it's stripped of all the ethical or physical constraints.
It has to be purely abstract for the theory to hold. He compares this theoretical ideal to an engineer constructing an engine with perfectly polished bearings to diminish friction.
Okay.
We know real life has friction, it has losses, limits, but the goal of the theoretical engineer, or the theoretical economist, is to describe that ideal, frictionless operation.
And this focus on exchangeable value, by necessity, forces him to sideline those, fuzzy concepts, utility, scarcity, and suitability that had dominated all the previous debates.
Precisely. Antoine Augustin Cournot saw that these indeterminate accessory ideas had caused the division of economists into conflicting schools, and it fueled the war waged between practical men and theorists.
So by making wealth purely exchangeable value, he established a fixed, measurable standard.
Yes. You can measure value in terms of money or a basket of other goods.
Yeah.
You cannot rigorously measure utility across different individuals. It's just not possible.
And this leads us directly to the most shocking and, I think, useful conceptual illustrations in the book, the creation and destruction paradoxes that arise solely from defining wealth by market value.
These examples are so important. So take the case of the publisher destroying books.
Right.
Let's say a publisher has a massive, unsaleable stock of a useful book. It's useful, but the market value is zero because the supply is just way too high.
So no one will pay for it.
Exactly. Now, if that publisher physically destroys 2/3 of the copies, Antoine Augustin Cournot states that the sordid act is a real creation of wealth in the commercial sense.
Wait, how can physical destruction be wealth creation? That sounds completely backwards.
Because the remaining 1/3 of the stock, now that it's scarce, acquires exchangeable value. The total asset value on the publisher's ledger increases because the price of the remaining items multiplied by their quantity is now greater than the previous total value.
So in the eyes of the commercial system, wealth was created.
It was. And the inverse holds true for destruction.
Okay, so what would that look like?
an industrial operation that consumes materials and labor to produce an unsaleable stock. A useless book, a product no one wants at any price, is, commercially speaking, a real destruction of wealth.
Even though materials were physically used and labor was expended.
Correct. The physical materials went in, then no exchangeable value came out.
He also uses the historical example of the Dutch East India Company destroying spices to maintain their monopoly profits.
Yes, and it might be contrary to society's interests, but it is a successful creation of commercial wealth for the company. It proves that market forces, fashion, whim, supply manipulation, they operate independently of genuine societal welfare.
And the diamond example really brings this distinction home, doesn't it?
It does. If a chemist suddenly discovered how to create diamonds cheaply, say for 1 franc per stone, this would lead to heavy losses for jewelers and current owners.
The mass of circulating wealth, defined as exchangeable value, would just plummet.
It would decrease dramatically. Yet Antoine Augustin Cournot says, no sensible person would call this a public calamity. The destruction of exchangeable value does not equate to the destruction of public good or utility.
That is a critical constraint on political economy itself. It establishes the discipline's limits.
Absolutely. Antoine Augustin Cournot acknowledges that the theory of wealth fails when relations are non-fixed or too complicated, especially when trying to compare, say, the material welfare of an industrious alpine shepherd with a relatively indolent Spanish gentleman.
And why is that?
Because you introduce moral causes, satisfaction, temperament, cultural norms, which are entirely incapable of measurement. His theory has to be limited to the measurable, the determinate, which is why the focus must remain strictly on exchangeable value.
Okay, so since Antoine Augustin Cournot was first and foremost a scientist, he grounded his economic concepts in the physical sciences. When he addresses value relativity, he turns directly to the concept of motion.
It's the perfect analogy. I mean, in physics, we say motion is only a change in situation relative to other bodies. We can't observe absolute motion.
Right.
Similarly, the value of a commodity can only be assigned by reference to other commodities. Hence, we deal with only relative values.
So if we look at the relative price ratio between gold and silver and that ratio changes, the variation might be due to a change in the cost or desire for gold or silver, or both at the same time.
And the intellectual challenge, then, is trying to deduce what we call the absolute changes from these observed relative changes. Antoine Augustin Cournot uses the great astronomical shift, determining whether the apparent motion of the stars is due to the Earth moving, which is Copernicus.
Or the stars moving around a fixed Earth, which is Ptolemy.
Exactly.
So if we observed through widespread statistical evidence that the relative value of money compared to pretty much all other goods fell by 4/5, while the relative values of those other goods stayed constant among themselves,
Then the most probable hypothesis is an absolute change in the value of money, even if we were totally ignorant of, say, the discovery of new American mines.
Yet this is where economics differs fundamentally from astronomy, isn't it? In Cournot's day, astronomers had largely settled on the sun as the fixed reference point.
Right. And in economics, a perfectly fixed term, an unchanging commodity to serve as an absolute yardstick, it simply doesn't exist. Wages vary, agricultural costs vary, everything moves.
So if a fixed term doesn't exist, how do you proceed with rigorous mathematical analysis?
This is where Antoine Augustin Cournot's solution is conceptual and, frankly, brilliant. He says since a perfect fixed term does not exist, we must imagine one. An abstract existence to facilitate the theory.
Like a conceptual anchor.
Yes, exactly. This abstract unit of value serves as a reference point, similar to astronomers imagining a mean sun endowed with a uniform motion to reference the real stars in their slightly erratic paths.
The phantom standard. It's a conceptual tool that anchors the theory, allowing for a consistent yardstick against which to measure real changes in value, even though that yardstick doesn't exist in the physical world.
And that intellectual bridge between abstract math and real-world prices is vital.
I can see that. And that conceptual tool is crucial when you start discussing monetary stability.
It is. Antoine Augustin Cournot emphasizes that monetary metals must, by their very nature, experience only slight absolute variations over short periods. If the value of money were perceptibly variable, then, he says, all transactions would be disturbed.
There would be, properly speaking, no contracts of sale.
Right, because no one would agree on the future worth of the exchange. It would be chaos.
He also addresses a common observation of the time, the widespread feeling that money is steadily diminishing in value. He connects this feeling not necessarily to monetary instability, but to the absolute upward movement of prices for the things people need most.
Right. Driven by population increase and the progressive development of industry and labor. Over long periods, the cost of extracting, manufacturing, and bringing goods to market often rises faster than improvements in technology can lower them, especially in agriculture.
So the prices of the articles needed by mankind are climbing steadily, an ascending movement that makes money feel less valuable, even if the money itself is relatively stable.
In essence, Antoine Augustin Cournot provides the framework to separate inflation and price volatility, what he'd call nominal changes, from the underlying variation in a commodity's real cost of production, using that abstract yardstick.
Before we jump into the differential calculus that defined his work on supply and demand, we need a brief pause. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast.
With the conceptual tools in place, the fixed definition of wealth and the relative nature of value, Antoine Augustin Cournot can proceed to the analysis of the market itself.
And this all rests on a single behavioral axiom.
A single axiom that each one seeks to derive the greatest possible value from his goods or his labor. This pursuit of maximum gain is the engine of the entire analysis.
This immediately brings us to his formalization of the law of demand, which is really the cornerstone of the whole edifice. He defines the quantity sold, dollars, as a function of the price, passer.
So dollars is pass.
He is mathematizing the common sense observation that as price decreases, the quantity demanded generally increases.
And this is where he demonstrates his rigor. He formalizes the general rule, but he meticulously details the exceptions.
He does. He acknowledged items of whim and luxury desirable only for their high price, what we now call Veblen goods, or items whose scarcity is part of their appeal. The famous diamond example is relevant again. If carbon crystallization suddenly made diamonds available for 1 franc, the demand for them as symbols of wealth or exclusivity would just collapse.
It would. The functional relationship, DFP, would be radically restructured, even if diamonds retain some industrial utility.
And Antoine Augustin Cournot is clear about something here. This function, phi cannot be expressed by an algebraic formula a priori, like a law of physics.
No, it has to be determined empirically through observation and statistical documents. But crucially, the analyst's job is to assign determinate relations even to these unknown functions.
And that is the genius of his method. Even if we don't know the precise curve of demand, we know its general properties.
We know it must be downward sloping, and in wide markets it must be continuous, meaning consumption doesn't suddenly jump dramatically, but changes smoothly in response to price changes.
That continuity is vital, isn't it? Because it makes the calculus possible.
It does. It means that for small variations in price, the demand variations are sensibly proportional and of opposite signs. That proportionality is the verbal explanation of the differential coefficient.
Which is the marginal change in demand due to the marginal change in price.
Exactly.
This conceptual language leads us directly to the first major application, the monopoly problem. The monopolist seeks to maximize their gross receipts, which is the price multiplied by the quantity sold. They are maximizing the area under the demand curve.
And maximizing any function is a problem solved by differential calculus. Antoine Augustin Cournot shows the monopolist must find the price that satisfies the condition that the derivative of the gross receipts function is 0.
Okay, so let's break that down. Instead of just reciting the equation, what does that derivative being 0 actually mean for the monopolist in plain English?
It means the monopolist must keep lowering the price until they reach the point where the revenue gained from selling 1 extra unit is exactly offset by the revenue lost due to having to lower the price on all the previous units.
Ah, so that point is the maximizing price.
That's the sweet spot. It's the definition of marginal revenue being 0, in simple terms.
Right.
And Cournot even provided a graphic interpretation. He visually described this point using the geometry of tangents and vectors, showing that determining this optimal price is a key application for statistical observation.
The model then becomes more complex but more realistic when he introduces the cost of production, which he calls phi day. Now the monopolist is maximizing net receipts.
Right, they are maximizing 21st-D. And this introduces another function, the marginal cost, phi day, which is the increase in cost incurred by producing 1 additional unit.
And the resulting equation shows a fundamental truth that holds in all subsequent economics, doesn't it? The producer will always stop increasing production when the increase in expense.
The marginal cost exceeds the increase in gross receipts or marginal revenue. Yes. And this provides elegant proof that for a monopolist, the price PLI must always be significantly greater than the marginal cost phase 2. If they charged a price close to their cost, they wouldn't maximize their profit.
So they restrict their output and raise the price to find that sweet spot determined by the calculus.
Exactly. And that simple observation just paved the way for all future regulation and study of market power.
So building that monopoly foundation allows Antoine Augustin Cournot to move into the theory of competition. And this is where he truly shocked his contemporaries. He didn't just assert the benefits of competition, he proved its stability and impact mathematically.
Yes, starting with the famous model of a duopoly, competition between two proprietors. The example is two owners of mineral water springs.
Okay, so you have two guys, two springs.
Right. If those two proprietors secretly agree, they act as a monopoly, maximizing their total income according to the rules we just discussed. But if they act independently, each trying to maximize their own individual income, this system behaves very differently.
And this is where he modeled what we now call a reaction function, right? So proprietor A sets a quantity based on what they think proprietor B will produce, and vice versa.
Exactly. And Antoine Augustin Cournot proved that this back-and-forth reaction, where each producer responds to the other's prior move, leads to a stable equilibrium.
So it's not a runaway train of price wars.
No, it settles into a predictable, stable point. He showed that if one producer deviates, the predictable optimizing reaction of the other brings the system back toward that stable state in a series of constantly declining adjustments.
And the key finding, proven mathematically, confirms the common belief, but with analytical certainty.
Competition reduces prices. The stable equilibrium price for two competitors is always lower than the price set by a single monopoly.
This was revolutionary because it gave policymakers a quantitative reason to promote competition, moving beyond just vague philosophical arguments.
And Antoine Augustin Cournot didn't stop there. He scaled the model.
Right. As the number of competing producers NOG increases indefinitely, approaching what we call perfect competition.
The mathematical equation changes again, leading the price to approach the limit where P equals parts D, price equals marginal cost.
And that is the formal mathematical definition of perfect competition, a concept that is foundational to every economics textbook written since 1838.
It is. It tells us that in a highly competitive market, output is maximized and price is driven down to the minimum cost required to produce the last unit.
Now, this leads to a crucial and often overlooked part of his analysis. His structural distinction between industries based on the nature of the production cost or marginal cost.
Yes, he identified two radically different economic structures. For manufactured goods, Antoine Augustin Cournot observed that the marginal cost is often decreasing as total production increases.
So as you make more widgets, the cost of making the next widget gets cheaper because of economies of scale.
Exactly. Better organization, larger machines, volume discounts.
Okay.
And Cournot noted that such industries generally only yield a sufficient net income under a monopoly or limited competition.
Why is that?
Because if competition were truly unlimited in an industry with decreasing marginal cost, prices would be driven below average costs, making the business unsustainable for small, less efficient producers. This is the structural condition that leads toward natural monopolies or oligopolies.
But for real estate, agriculture, fisheries, or mines, the structure is the complete opposite.
Here, fuel is increasing with dollars. To produce more, you have to use less fertile land, dig deeper shafts, or use more labor to extract the next unit.
So the cost of the marginal unit rises.
It does. And this is why these properties yield a net revenue even under unlimited competition and great subdivision. Marginal cost increases until it equals the price, but all the production units that operate at a lower cost, the most fertile land or the most accessible mine, earn a massive surplus.
And that surplus, the unearned income derived from the superiority of the production factor, is what we now call economic rent.
That's right. Antoine Augustin Cournot's mathematical distinction between increasing and decreasing marginal cost provides a rigorous theoretical foundation for understanding Ricardian land rent.
Moving to Chapter 8, where competition is truly unlimited and no individual producer can influence the price.
The determination simplifies. The total supply, omega dollars, must equal total demand, keep it actual. The price is set purely by the intersection of the two functions.
And here he analyzes the effect of an equal increase in cost, say a new regulatory fee or tax applied universally. He proves mathematically that the resulting new price pat will be greater than the original price P dollars, but
But PP,
which is a crucial finding on tax incidence. The price rises by less than the increase in cost.
The producers cannot simply pass the entire cost increase onto the consumer. They have to absorb some of it themselves, otherwise demand would collapse too severely. The shifting of the burden is partial, and the precise proportion is mathematically determined by the elasticities of the supply and demand curves.
This analytical framework that he built provided the ability to perform early, sophisticated incidence analysis, determining who truly bears the burden of a tax.
And this leads to profound insights into economic inefficiency, especially under monopoly conditions.
So let's look first at a direct tax on income, which is fixed or proportional, levied on the monopolist's net profit.
This tax will have no direct influence on the price or the quantity produced.
Wait, really? That seems wrong somehow. Why wouldn't it?
Because the price and output are determined by maximizing the profit function. If you simply subtract a fixed percentage from the total maximized profit, you don't change the decision variables, pain and dollars that led to that maximum point in the first place.
So the monopolist is already charging the price that yields the highest possible profit.
Exactly. Subtracting a tax from that profit does not give them an incentive to charge more or produce less.
So the consumer is unaffected, but the tax still has a cost to society.
Yes. Antoine Augustin Cournot points out that it acts as an obstacle to the creation of new investments. If the tax reduces the expected profit rate below the rate of interest, new capital will simply not enter this enterprise. It particularly injures the initial investors and innovators.
Okay, now compare that to the indirect or specific tax on the commodity. A tax, each dollar's laid directly on the product itself.
Now, this does influence the optimal pricing strategy, as it increases the marginal cost directly. It forces the monopolist to maximize a new function, gross receipts minus the cost of production and the tax liability.
And this calculation leads to one of Antoine Augustin Cournot's most important counterintuitive results regarding price determination. This is where the simple equality between the tax burden and the price increase breaks down entirely.
Correct. Depending on the specific shape of the demand function, the increase in cost, the taxed L&L, may augment the final price by more or less than the tax itself.
More? How could it be more?
Well, if demand is very inelastic, people need the product regardless of price. The monopolist may take the opportunity of the cost change to raise the price significantly more than the tax, maximizing their profit in the new constrained environment.
So the market determines the tax shifting, and in some cases, the consumer ends up paying the government's tax plus extra profit to the monopolist.
Precisely. But the most damning result of this analysis is his proof of inefficiency. Antoine Augustin Cournot calculated the total loss borne by consumers who continue to buy the product.
Which is the total extra money they pay.
Right. And he compared this to the gain to the Treasury from the tax. And he proved mathematically that the loss to consumers is always greater than the gain to the Treasury.
This is a pure measure of what we now call deadweight loss.
Economic inefficiency. Society loses more value than the government collects in revenue. The consumption that ceases due to the higher price is lost value that benefits no one. This was a profound, quantifiable indictment of specific taxation under monopoly.
And he had a practical note on collection timing, too.
He did. He observed that it is always better for everyone, the consumer, the producer, the treasury, if the tax is paid late, ideally by the final consumer.
Why is that?
Because if the tax is levied on an intermediate agent, that agent has to employ additional capital to front the tax money, and they will naturally demand a return on that capital, which gets passed on in the final price, increasing it even further than the tax itself.
Antoine Augustin Cournot didn't limit his analysis to single markets. He started modeling complex economic systems.
Starting with composite commodities goods made from two component articles, supplied by two separate monopolists, A and B.
And this is another fascinating paradox. We normally assume that breaking up power leads to better outcomes for consumers, but here,
if monopolist A and monopolist B operate independently, each maximizing their own separate profit, the result is actually worse for the final consumer than if they fused into one company.
Wait, so an association of monopolists lowers the price? How does that work?
It's because under separation, each monopolist is setting their own markup, assuming the other's price is fixed. This leads to a kind of double markup in the final good.
I see.
The price for component one is high, and then the manufacturer of the final good uses that high price to determine their own production, which leads to a suboptimal final quantity and a higher price for the composite commodity.
But when they fuse, they act as a single entity, maximizing total profit from the composite good.
Exactly. When they fuse, they optimize the entire supply chain, lowering the input costs internally and realizing that a lower final price leads to maximized total profit. Thus, Antoine Augustin Cournot proves that the separation of monopolies makes the composite commodity more expensive.
That's a powerful counterintuitive finding that requires the rigor of his math to confirm.
It really is.
Now, let's move to composite commodities under unlimited competition and apply a uniform tax dollar to only one component article.
The effects are highly subtle. The tax dollar on component 1 yields 3 distinct mathematically proven results. First, the price of the tax article rises, but by less than the tax. We've seen that before.
Right.
Second, the price of the untaxed complementary article falls.
Why would the price of the untaxed component fall?
Because the overall cost of the composite good rose. The total demand for that composite good falls. And since demand for the second component is derived entirely from the demand for the composite good, the reduced overall market demand forces its price down.
And the third result?
The price of the composite article rises, but by less than the full tax levied on the first article, because the fall in the price of the second one partially compensates for the tax increase on the first.
It shows how taxes ripple through a supply chain, not just vertically, but horizontally.
Creating these compensatory price adjustments, it's a deep market connection that's impossible to trace accurately without this kind of functional analysis.
Now, we turn to trade barriers in Chapter X, examining trade between an exporting market A and an importing market B. And here, Cournot challenges the common assumption that trade communication always increases total production.
He does. By analyzing the supply and demand curves in both markets simultaneously, he shows that the total quantity produced across the two markets may or may not increase. He provides specific mathematical cases where the isolation of markets might, counterintuitively, lead to higher overall consumption and production.
Okay, let's focus on his analysis of a duty, a tax dollars, on a commodity traveling from A to B. What are the non-obvious consequences?
The finding is highly counterintuitive. The duty always lowers the price in the exporting market, A.
It lowers it.
Yes. The duty restricts the size of the market available to A's producers, shrinking overall demand and forcing the local price in A down. It may raise or lower the price in the importing market B, but the deflation in the exporting market is guaranteed.
And what about a bounty, a subsidy paid for trade from A to B?
The bounty always lowers the price in the importing market, B, which is the intended outcome. However, it may lower or raise the price in the exporting market, A, again depending on the relative slopes of supply and demand.
So this precise, non-symmetrical analysis gave Antoine Augustin Cournot the mathematical ammunition to critique the simple anti-barrier arguments of the Smith school.
It did. He proved that raising a barrier for one commodity creates an advantage for the exporting market by increasing its national income, providing a theoretical basis for the theory of barriers that could not be dismissed as merely absurd or economically illiterate.
And that brings us to his final conceptual section on the social income.
Yes, this brings the analysis to the macro level. Antoine Augustin Cournot defines the social income as the aggregate of all individual incomes, rents, profits, wages, stipends, the ultimate measure of a nation's economic well-being.
And to analyze how policy affects this aggregate, he introduces the most critical conceptual distinction for the entire text: nominal versus real variation in income.
Right. Nominal variation is the change in income measured in currency terms for the producers of that specific commodity. It's producer-centric. Did the total revenue generated by this sector go up or down?
Whereas real variation is the actual loss or gain to society as a whole.
Yes, measured by the value destroyed or created due to changes in consumption. It is consumption-centric. It represents the value of consumption that was lost or gained, valued at the original price.
The paradox of monopoly provides the perfect illustration once more.
It does. If a commodity moves from unlimited competition to a monopoly, the monopolist maximizes PDD, which causes a nominal increase in social income. It looks good on paper for the producing sector.
But society suffers because the monopolist restricts output and raises prices.
And that's confirmed by the real variation, which is a decrease. Antoine Augustin Cournot's mathematics confirms that the true loss to society is measured by the value lost due to reduced consumption.
So this distinction shows that sound economic policy must always prioritize the real consumption-centric value over the nominal producer-centric value.
When you're assessing societal gain or loss, absolutely. We can apply this immediately back to taxation. A consumption tax, for instance, may increase the nominal social income, but it will always diminish its actual value by causing reduced consumption.
This framework then allows Antoine Augustin Cournot to revisit the contentious issue of free trade versus barriers.
Right. He analyzes the influence of trade, specifically exportation from A to B. For the exporting market, A, he found that exportation always leads to an actual increase in the national income.
So exporting is wealth creating for the source market.
Yes. The profits from selling abroad, compensated for the slight loss of consumption in the home market, result in a net gain. But for the importing market, B, importation always leads to an actual diminution of the national income.
Provided the imported commodity competes with local production.
Exactly. The reason is that the value lost from the local industry that ceases production due to the cheaper imports is a real loss of national income, measured by the reduction in consumption and production value.
This is truly significant. By proving mathematically that importation causes a real diminution of national income when local competition exists, Antoine Augustin Cournot provides the most rigorous theoretical basis possible for the argument used by protectionists.
It validates the logic of their case, even if he doesn't personally endorse the policy. However, he provides the critical compensatory factor when discussing internal markets. He defines a fundamental principle: transportation as wealth creation.
How does that work?
If transportation between two parts of the same territory is carried out by home agents and capital, the business itself creates profits that more than compensate for any localized losses caused by goods being moved.
So the key takeaway is that internal trade necessarily increases the real value of the national income because the capital and profits stay within the system.
Precisely. This structural difference, the profits of transportation remaining entirely within the national income, is what maximizes the real value of the nation. When trade happens internationally, those profits and capital returns accrue to a foreign power, eliminating the critical compensation.
Which causes that net real diminution in the importing market, assuming local industry is competitive.
Exactly. Thus, Cournot establishes that the benefit of internal free trade is fundamentally different from the benefit of international free trade, providing a complex and nuanced mathematical foundation for understanding the mechanics of trade barriers.
So, Antoine Augustin Cournot's recherches took a field previously defined by philosophy and prose and gave it the language of functions, derivatives, and stable equilibrium.
It's the text that truly defined the modern mathematical economist.
Let's summarize the 5 central takeaways that should stick with you. First, wealth is measurable value. Economic analysis requires strictly defining wealth as exchangeable value, distinct from unmeasurable concepts like utility.
Second, mathematics is essential. Mathematical analysis is necessary to define the relations, the arbitrary functions that govern economic phenomena, allowing us to find optimums and stable states with precision, moving past literary obscurity.
Third, competition reduces prices. Through the rigorous duopoly and perfect competition models, he proved that prices always fall below the monopoly maximum, validating the efficacy of competitive markets.
Fourth, taxes impose double losses. Specific taxes or monopolies inherently impose a greater quantifiable loss on consumers than the corresponding benefit gained by the Treasury, demonstrating quantifiable economic inefficiency, the deadweight loss.
And finally, the real versus nominal income. The key to analyzing economic policy correctly is distinguishing between the nominal or producer-centric and real or societal consumption-centric changes in social income.
Right, resolving the paradoxes of both monopoly and taxation.
Antoine Augustin Cournot established the analytical tools, the equations, the functions, the distinctions between real and nominal value to examine economic policies with unprecedented clarity.
He demonstrated that while policy goals might be moral or political, the mechanics of wealth creation and distribution could be pinned down with science.
But this leaves us with a provocative exit question.
It does. Antoine Augustin Cournot showed that certain policies, like the theoretical use of trade barriers, are mathematically possible ways to maximize national income, contrary to simple free trade dogma. Yet he believed ultimate decisions belong to a higher power. So, if mathematics can prove the economic logic of protectionism and also prove the unavoidable inefficiency of taxation, what does this foundational text tell us about the limits of relying solely on analytical models to solve the deeply moral, social, and political problems we face today?
Something to mull over until our next deep dive. Thanks for listening.